Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us on Facebook Live. I'm Jessie Chen, the founder of Immigrants Career Growth. Today we have Robert Lillis joining us live. He is a space scientist at UC Berkeley Space Science Laboratory, currently involved in a range of research projects, primarily focused on Mars. Hi Rob. Thanks for
Hi,
joining.
Jesse.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for inviting me on.
Sure. We are very much looking forward to hearing your stories as a successful space scientist and immigrant living in the US. To get us started, how about you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Okay, so I'm Rob Lillis. I'm a research physicist at the UC Berkeley Space Sciences Laboratory. So, a space scientist. I'm from Ireland originally. Been in America since 2001. I guess that's it.
Okay, wonderful. So, can you talk a bit more about how you got into the science field? Did you always know that you wanted to be a space scientist?
Well, I always knew that I loved physics and space. I didn't actually figure out that I was going to be a space scientist, particularly until I got to grad school. But ever since I was a kid, I always loved physics and space and science. I remember I used to watch like documentaries about the Apollo moon landings and the space shuttle, and I used to just think it was so cool. And then I remember in 1989, when I was 9 years old, the NASA Voyager spacecraft flew past the planet Neptune, giving us our first ever view of this brand new world, and it was just so mind blowing. I just thought it was amazing. And then my dad used to buy these popular science books and leave them on the coffee table, and I used to read them. And I remember I read Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, when I was 15. I thought I didn't understand most of it. It was super complicated, but I just thought it was really interesting, and I thought it'd be just really cool to work to sort of try to solve the mysteries of the universe. So I always knew that I loved this stuff, but I didn't really know that I wanted to do it as a career. Um, so my dad was in banking and finance, and I thought, oh, that's a nice, sensible, stable job, and that's probably what I should do. And so I sort of had this dilemma when I was, 14, 15, 16, about what I wanted to do. And then I had a guidance counselor in high school who told me a very important thing. He said, if you want to um, go do a degree in physics or math or something like that, and then you want to go into business or finance later, you can learn that stuff kind of on the job. And so that's still that door is still totally open to you if you do a degree in science or engineering or math or something. Whereas if you do a degree in business and then you decide when you're 22 that you want to be a scientist, you got to go back and start at the very beginning. So you got to spend an extra 4 years. So once he explained that to me, I was like, oh, okay, so I'm not closing any doors by deciding to do a degree in science. And so that's why I went down the path of getting educated in math and physics. And then it was when I got to Berkeley as a grad student that I noticed there were a lot of interesting space projects, and that's when I became a space scientist in particular, and not just a broad kind of a physicist.
Wow, that's very interesting. So back in high school, when you took the advice, did you validate that with anyone, or you just kind of took the advice and carried it over until today?
I mean, that was kind of, I mean, I guess the web did exist in 1996, but it was pretty basic. There wasn't a lot of good information on it. I talked to my parents, talked to one of my dad's friends, I think, but like I trusted the guidance counselor and I knew that he was good, so that ended up being good advice. But obviously, today I would go and do, a big web search, of course.
Okay, let's let's dive deeper into your background. So you have been a space scientist since 2001, right? Started as a graduate research assistant after you graduated from college in Ireland, where you
Hmm.
studied theoretical physics.
Hmm.
Then you moved to the US right after to study at University of California, Berkeley, where
Hmm.
you got your master degree in physics. And after that, you spent another 3 years at UC Berkeley, the same school, where you got your PhD also in physics in
That's right.
2006.
Hmm.
And we're now in 2020. So that has
Yes.
been 19 years, and you never
Yes.
change your profession, which is very impressive and also pretty rare. especially given you live in San Francisco, California, where you are surrounded by so many technology companies. So I remember you telling me that scientists in the US actually do not get paid a lot, but since the cost of living in San Francisco is so high, and the fact that you have the advantage to switch your career path to become a data scientist, for example, at a top-notch company and get paid a lot more. That makes me wonder, why haven't you made that move?
Okay, well, I guess a couple of things. I just want to address what you said earlier about staying in the same profession for 19 years. I mean, scientists, that's pretty typical for scientists, actually. And it usually takes people, the first 5 years are getting your PhD, and that's sort of like the equivalent of an apprenticeship. And then you typically do a postdoctoral job, and then you go on to either become a professor or like a research professor like I am, a staff scientist like that. So it's not, and it's the projects that we do are so long term that you kind of have to stay in for the long term. Like you might start planning a mission to Mars in 2006 and it doesn't launch till 2013, and it takes a whole year to get. So the point is, it's normal to have these sorts of long career trajectories, and it's similar in biology and chemistry. Often projects just that's how long they take. They take years. So that's to address what you said earlier. But to answer your question about the sort of the choice to stay in and how that relates to salaries, etc. It's worth walking people through sort of what the salary trajectory is if you become a scientist. So typically after you finish your undergrad, you go into a PhD program. Now, unlike grad school and like MBA or something like that, or law school, you don't pay them, they actually pay you to do a PhD. But it's only about $35,000 a year. But still, you don't have any debt. So you're paid pretty badly for 5 years, but you're not building up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt like if you went to law school, say. And then typically when you become a postdoc, you typically do that for like a year or two after you get your PhD, and that's typically about $65,000 a year. So it's not great money. But then as you go on from there, you become either like an assistant professor or the equivalent of, say, like a staff scientist title at either a national lab or like a NASA center or like the Berkeley Space Science Lab where I am. Those salaries typically start around 90,000, and they go up to, after say 10 years, more like 120, 130,000. And that doesn't sound like a lot of money in the Bay Area, but actually those salaries are typically the same all across the US. So if you don't live in a really expensive area like San Francisco or New York, it's actually a pretty good salary. It's a very solid middle class salary. So I don't want people thinking that scientists are paid poorly everywhere. Just in relation to Bay Area housing costs, scientists maybe are not paid that well.
Right, for sure. I didn't mean to say that scientists don't get paid well in general. I should have been more cleared on that topic, which is in San Francisco when the cost of living is super high.
Yes.
And when you think about that number in comparison to how much money you need to have a pretty comfortable life, right? And because you live in San Francisco, have you ever struggle with that?
A data scientist.
Yeah, like have you ever struggled that maybe your passion isn't providing you as much financial security as you would like it to be, and maybe that you might think of another career path?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, it's something that it's something I have definitely thought about, but I think just talking about my own case, I've been relatively lucky in that I bought an apartment in 2009 when Bay Area property was cheap after the recession, and I've gotten some good promotions. So I'm doing okay financially myself because of those sort of lucky instances. But I totally understand people, scientists who I know, who they were say 1 or 2 or 3 years after their PhD, and they just wanted a normal life in the Bay Area, and they left and became data scientists. I can think of at least 4 who did that, and I fully understand that because you can make a lot more money doing that. The question that you have to balance is are you doing a job that you really love? And this is the whole question of money versus passion. So those two things have to be balanced, and it'll be different for everybody.
Um, yeah, it for sure is gonna be different for everybody. It depends on where they live and how much passion they do have for science versus to
Right,
build their finance.
right.
Do you have any advice for those people who are struggling? Do you think they should follow hard as what you are doing, or should they be focused on securing their finance first?
Well, the first thing I would say is don't do a job that makes you miserable because your own mental health and well-being is more important than anything else. So don't do a job that you're going to just hate doing. Doesn't matter how much it pays.
Yeah, I love
However,
that.
I think there are plenty of interesting jobs, particularly for I'd imagine most of your viewers are probably are pretty fairly educated and so probably have a range of options. I think there's no difficulty in finding interesting work that pays enough to live comfortably in a place like, say, New York City or the Bay Area. Those jobs exist. The question is, um, there's sort of three different pieces to it as I see. One is the salary and whether that salary and your own personal financial situation, like maybe you have a higher earning spouse or lower earning spouse or that kind of thing. So there's the financial stability aspect. Then there's the interesting job aspect. Like, are the problems that you're solving at work interesting? And for a lot of jobs in say like the data science jobs in the Bay Area, the problems are really actually pretty darn interesting. Like there's some great data sets, there's some interesting problems these companies are trying to solve. Um, and then the third piece of it is the passion piece. Are those problems the companies are trying to solve, the problems that you're working on, do those problems really motivate you? Do they drive you to sort of work extra hard? Like are they your passion? And some people need all three of those things. Some people just need one. Some people need two out of that. The interesting job, the passion for the job, and the money. And so for everyone, that balance is going to be different. You need to make sure that you feel satisfied at work.
For sure. How do you feel about your balance on passion and money? Do you feel like you are getting all three, or are you still looking to get more of a fulfillment?
The thing I'll say about money is that all the studies show that people don't get any happier after they make more than a certain amount of money. There's like a certain level, and you definitely happiness increases up to that level, but then it doesn't increase anymore after that level. And I think, given my own personal, financial situation, I'm making enough money that I'm comfortable with it, and I'm lucky enough to have a job that's both really challenging, really interesting, and I'm really passionate about. So I count myself to be very lucky, not only to have found this job, but to be living in a country that decides to spend a lot of money on space science, which
Mm-hmm.
is sort of a very, it's work that doesn't have an immediate return, but it does in the long term, and it's very inspiring for people. And in Europe, they don't spend nearly as much money on space science as the U.S. does. So I'm happy to be here in a country where I can do a job where the taxpayers pay me to do something that I love.
Super awesome. I would like to dive deeper in that in a little bit. Now, let's shift gear a little bit. So, since you've been working at the Space Science Lab for many years, can you talk about what's the culture like there? Do you feel fitting as an immigrant? What are some changes you have seen over the years on, say, diversity on your team?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing I'll say is that science in America, especially when you remove the U.S. government secret classified science that no one knows about, but like public science, there's a lot of immigrants. I would say more than 50% of scientists are immigrants.
More than
I remember,
50%?
yeah, yeah.
Whoa, that's a lot.
There's just this huge number of immigrants. They fill a very important role. So I remember like my first job as a postdoc after I got my PhD at Berkeley. I was in a room, a big room with maybe 12 cubicles in it, something like that, 10 anyway. And I heard 6 different languages every single day at work. I heard Chinese, Japanese, English, French, German, and Norwegian. Then
Hmm.
that was just in one room because people would be talking to their friends or their family and stuff on the phone. And so it was
Right.
very, very immigrant heavy, very immigrant friendly to work in science. There's a lot of immigrants. So the Americans who do work in science are so used to having immigrant colleagues and friends that it really isn't weird. So that's definitely a place where immigrants shouldn't feel too uncomfortable.
This might sound a little strange, this question, but I was curious among, so for all these immigrant workers, among their white colleagues, do they feel pressured to compete with their white colleagues? Is there any like invisible competition going on?
I've never noticed that, so I'm not sure. I mean, science, okay, I should only speak to my own experience, but in space science, it's very collaborative. It's
Okay.
always been the situation that we have way more data
Mm.
than we have people to analyze it. So there's no real competition between different scientists. I mean, occasionally a scientist, steps on another scientist's toes and like, oh, sorry, I didn't know you were working on this. I'll go do something else. And you work it out like, adults. So it's been pretty collaborative, and I've never noticed that kind of competition. And definitely, I've never ever noticed competition that divides the white Americans from the immigrants. I've never noticed that. If anyone tried to do that, they'd be like, "Dude, what are you doing? That's messed up. Like, don't
Right.
do that." But to address your earlier question about changes I've seen over the years and diversity, when I came to the field in 2001, it was a lot more. It definitely was pretty male dominated, and not as much as it would have been in like 1970. That would have been like extremely male dominated. So
Mm.
things have definitely been moving in the right direction. But since then, in the last 20 years, I've noticed in space physics and particularly planetary science. I'm in planetary science, and I've noticed that in planetary science, the numbers of people, the numbers of women is almost 50-50 now, at least in terms of people who are under 35 or under 40 years old. So
Oh,
it's
that's a
it's
very amazing
the
number. Yeah.
the diversity situation has gotten
Hmm.
much better.
This is great. Awesome. Perfect. I'm so happy to hear that. We for sure that will encourage a lot more female scientists to become female students who are studying science to get into the scientist field.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although one thing I will say is that unfortunately, amongst so there's a lot more women and there's a lot of immigrants, but amongst the Americans in science, it's still too white. It still needs to be more diverse. There needs to be more people of color from the American perspective in science. So that's improving as well, but improving more
Mm.
slowly, sadly.
What can you talk about more? Why does it need to be more white? Is it because the majority of like the in that 50% of immigrants is still pretty white, and then on top of that, there are other white colleagues, or are
Um,
you talking about colors in side of immigrants
no,
or in
no, I'm
general?
talking. Yeah, amongst the Americans, amongst the U.S. born people, it's
Oh, okay.
it's it's yeah. I mean, the immigrants come from everywhere. I mean, well,
Mm-hmm.
not everywhere. It's mostly Europe and Asia. That's pretty much where science is mostly. It's in Europe and Asia. But amongst the Americans, it's still very white. And I think that's because a lot of immigrants have um, there's a desire and a family pressure to go make a lot of money instead of go and follow your passion and follow your
Mm.
heart. And so it takes like another generation or two of being sort of middle class before parents are willing to tell their children, go do whatever makes you happy, go be whatever you want to be. The first generation of immigrants, the parents don't tend to say that. They tend to say, go be successful. And so
Right.
people don't think about science as successful. sadly, at least in America. So I think it takes a little while for that to go through before you see the scientist population of American-born people a bit more diverse. But it'll happen. It'll just take a bit of time.
What is the culture like in Ireland growing up? Do people think doing science is a successful job, or do they think differently?
More so than here, yes. I think in Europe in general, scientist is a more respected career than it is here, and that's I think probably something to do with the fact that taxes are higher in Europe, so even people who make a lot of money don't make as much money as they make here, and so the scientist salary relative to other salaries after taxes is more similar, I think. So that's how people sort of appreciate science. But is your question more about like other aspects of culture, or
Yeah, for example, did your parents encourage you to become a scientist, or did they kind of just like, yeah, we'll support whatever you do?
pretty much they said like, well, okay, they said a couple things. They said go do what makes you happy. That was the first thing they said, and they said there will always be jobs for people who are smart, and you're smart. And then they told me that. So they, and that, it was nice to have them say that to me over and over again, that I wouldn't have to worry about a job because they thought I was smart enough. And I mean, whether or not that's true, that gave me confidence. So I think encouraging children is really important
Right.
to help them succeed. So
Which,
they always,
for that part, it sounds pretty similar as what the American culture is here, right? Like parents are pretty encouraging. They will not go pick a career for their kids versus it's very
yeah,
different in Asia. So
yes.
can you talk about the cultural difference between Ireland and America? What is the biggest difference?
Well, the culture difference is not that big. I mean, there's a much bigger difference between the US and Asia, for
Right.
example, and even between the US and like Germany. I think, like Irish immigrants form a big part of the white American gene pool, and so something like 40 or 50 million Americans claim to be at least half Irish. I'm not sure if I believe that, but it's
Oh,
still it's still like it's a lot of people
that's
though,
a
and
lot.
St.
Uh-huh.
Patrick's Day is really big here. So
Uh-huh.
moving to America was not a huge culture shock, and in fact, it wasn't even that bad because I lived in America for 4 years as a child as well, from when I was 6 until when I was 10.
Oh,
So I really was very comfortable with America and Americans. I,
okay.
I didn't feel like I was American. I definitely felt Irish, but I was very comfortable with Americans, because in Ireland we haven't got a lot of our own TV, so like half our TV is British and half is American.
Mm.
So all the slang, the idioms, the movies, like not every TV show, but like the popular ones like Friends, blah blah blah, like Seinfeld, etc. Like we had all that growing up in
Mm-hmm.
Ireland, so the culture shock wasn't really that big. But there's still some important differences. One is I think success is really celebrated in America. Financial success in a way that it isn't so much in Ireland. Like it's okay to be successful in Ireland, but you don't want to act like you're being successful. Like being humble is really important. And like for example, I've often taken this, like if you're in New York City and there's a stretch limousine going down the street or something, the average New Yorker would be like, oh, that person's done very well for themselves. In Ireland, they would say, who's that flash bastard? Who does he think he is? Like, does he think he's better than me? That's there's a sort of a begrudgery a little bit there, which is it's not always healthy, but I think it's good to keep things in perspective and keep people's feet on the ground so they don't get like their head doesn't get too big. That's a big difference, and Irish people tend to be, I mean, compared to like the British, Irish people, we don't think we're better than anybody else. Like sometimes the British do think that, and so that's like a difference between Irish and English culture. Of course, there are plenty of English people who don't think that. Of course, I'm not saying all English people are like that, but there's a difference in culture in that sense. Ireland has been such a, I mean, I'll just be honest. Ireland was such a terrible place to live for so long and so economically depressed that no one's really proud in the same way that they might be proud to come from like England. for
Mm-hmm.
example, a country that gave the world Shakespeare and, whatever and all this sort of stuff. So Irish people tend to be more down to earth,
Do you think
I think.
that's where that humbleness is from?
Yeah, it's from just hundreds of years of
Mm-hmm.
misery, I think. I'm I'm kind of kidding a little bit, but
Yeah.
like there's a reason that Irish people went all over the world, and they've been like immigrants that have, I mean, there's Irish bars in every big city in the entire world, and it's
Mm-hmm.
because things were so bad in Ireland that like the eldest son would inherit the farm, and everybody else had to leave because there was no jobs. So
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, there's a lot to talk about. Like, you will really have to dig deeper into it. But let's talk about. So, one thing I'm very curious to hear you giving your tips on is around public presentation.
Hmm.
And I know many immigrants are super curious on that topic as well. So I know you have done a lot of public presentation in your job. For example, you did an interview with Daily California on Mars arrival. You did an interview with Los Angeles Times on
Hmm.
Mars, and I can't remember the name. Sorry, like UAE plans for Mars,
Yeah, yeah, that's
right?
right.
And
That
then
was the
you
LA Times interview, yeah.
Yeah, and then you also did a TV interview with EU founded Spanish science show called
Hmm.
Escaping Atmosphere and many
Yep.
many more, which is to me is super impressive. Can you talk about your job needs in doing public presentations? Is it stressful at all that you always have to stand in front of a large audience sharing your knowledge about what you work on and thinking on your feet and answering questions on the fly? Was that stressful? Were you ever scared?
Yeah, terrified.
Terrible.
Especially when I was, starting out. And not only that, but I had a really bad stutter. Like
Oh,
I would, fumble over my words. And when you're giving a presentation in front of 200 scientists, all of whom are older than you, and who know more than you, it's really, really easy to get nervous. So what I
right.
would do is typically, especially for shorter presentations, like 10 or 15 minutes, I would just try to memorize as much as I could, practice as much as I could, so that I knew what I was going to say. And stuttering doesn't really happen when you know exactly what you're going to say. It's only when
Mm.
your mouth is trying to move faster than your brain that you end up going you know, and you have difficulty getting your words out. So practice is really important, and that's probably even more important for your viewers because English might not be their first language, and so practice is very, very important. But
Right.
it's something that all jobs people have to make presentations, but scientists, particularly public scientists, we have to because it's just part of our job.
Right. Were you ever afraid of being judged?
Of course, of course. In fact, I would say that fear is the greatest motivator that I've had in my career. Like fear of looking stupid in front of your colleagues. That's what makes you work harder to make sure that you actually make
Mm.
really good graphs and plots and slides, and that you can speak to them well. And there were times when, even when I had a bad stutter, there were times when colleagues said, "I know you had difficulty, stuttering up there, but your slides were really good." So it was nice to hear that, because yeah, fear is this maybe sounds bad, but like fear is a great motivator.
Right. So to overcome that challenge, you actually just turned the fear into motivation. Is that it, or did you do something else to overcome the fear?
uh, Turning the fear into motivation, and then also just practicing the words. Yeah, and that doesn't always work. Like if you're giving like a 45-minute talk, you can't memorize every word of a
Right.
45-minute talk.
I
That's
was
that's
just
just
gonna ask you
impossible.
that. And then what did you
Yeah.
do on
Oh
longer
well, you
presentations?
you try to remember a couple of key points to make on every slide, and if you can just remember those key points, then you things flow a little bit more easily then. um, but a lot of it's just doing it over and over again, and some of it just comes with time. As you get more and more respected, you become less worried about being judged because people already know you and they already hopefully like you. and then it gets easier like that. And I noticed that over time, my stutter went away as I became more confident. Um, it
Okay.
still hasn't totally gone away. There still could be times when it might come back, but
Yeah. So when you mentioned because people already know you, they will accept who you are. That's just how you do your presentation, and you are improving yourself, and which will give you more confident, right? Be less
hmm
self-conscious. What about doing presentation in front of strangers, like people who don't know you? Uh,
right.
how did you handle that kind of situation?
I mean, really, mostly the same way. I mean, you just have to be as well because even people who do know you, the first time you gave a presentation, they didn't know you,
Right.
and so you just have to be as open and as fluid as you can be. And again, even if you're nervous while you're up there giving the presentation, if you make good slides, that really helps a lot. And that's something that hard work does actually help with.
Mm.
And I will tell you that scientists can be really bad at making visually appealing slides. They can so many scientists they just put like bullet point blocks and blocks of text. I'm like, come on, man, like
That's
you can do better than
exactly what
that.
I
Like,
wanted to ask you next.
yeah.
Do you hire any visual designers who make slides for you, or somehow you're just more creative than the average scientist?
Well, it depends. If I'm making a slide deck for other scientists, they don't expect like beautiful graphics. Like they wouldn't expect someone with say like your talents to go and do that. Like nobody expects that
Mm.
standard. But they want you to make an effort. But they want you to make it so there's not too many words on a slide. Just even something as simple as if you're showing a graph, just make sure that the font is big enough
Right.
on the X and Y axes. Like that's so basic, but so many people don't get that right. But when you're doing a big proposal, like if you're asking NASA for like 50, $60 million, $100 million, like it's a big proposal, and you and your team have put a lot of work into it, yes, it is totally worth spending a few $1,000s to hire a graphic designer to make the cover page look really good. And we
Mm-hmm.
have done that a couple of times. Yeah, actually, I'm working with someone right now down at the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab to make our report look good. So yes, it is.
Whoa.
It's worth bringing in a professional, but it's worth being good enough at things like Illustrator that you don't have to go to the professionals unless it's a really big deal.
Mm-hmm. What about your accent when you do public presentations? Are you concerned about how you sound, or are you just totally loving your accent?
I mean, I'm lucky enough to be a native English speaker
Yeah.
and to have a relatively clear accent. And that's just luck. That isn't anything that I worked on. But I'm not really aware of it. I would say that sometimes my Irish accent gets a bit thicker when I'm talking, but not in any way that makes me not understandable.
What about when you listen to presentations that's been done by immigrants like myself who have thicker accents? How do you like? Do you have any advice for those people? Because when you listen to presentations by them, like, do you feel like there's enough patience inside of you to just sit there to finish the entire talk, or do you think, oh, if they could have done this, I would be happier sitting there listening?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say 95% of the time I'm so used to hearing a lot of accents when I go to conferences that I'm pretty good at following it, but sometimes
Mm.
someone is just it's so thick that you just can't follow it. It's just and again that's pretty rare, maybe like less than 1 in 20 times. And those people partly it's just bad luck because I mean I've met a lot of researchers from say China or from Japan who have extremely say clear English, like but then others who just don't, and sometimes they come from the same background and there's no good reason. But I think it's worth taking lessons from a voice coach if you are in that 5% of people who are just really thick. But mostly, I would say that scientists have a lot of patience for people with accents because, like I said, 50% of people who work in the U.S. in science are foreigners, and so you need to be patient, and most people are patient.
Right. I have a follow-up question. Do you get paid to do those public presentations, or is that just part of your job?
I consider it part of my job. If some tech company were to offer to pay me to say go give a talk, then sure, I would take the money. But I don't consider getting paid part of my job. Like I am paid by the taxpayer through NASA to not just do the science, not just to investigate the mysteries of the Martian atmosphere,
Mm-hmm.
for example, but I'm also paid to publicize that, and that doesn't just mean writing papers and making presentations in front of other scientists. That also means communicating what I'm doing to the general public, and that's through talking to reporters, giving public lectures, and so
Mm-hmm.
that's a part of my job that I do actually really enjoy, and I take reasonably seriously because I know who's my real boss is the U.S. taxpayer.
US tax. So we're paying you to do all these public presentations. That's what you're
Yeah,
saying.
exactly. And so if I'm not doing that, like if you don't know, so like if you, the taxpayer, don't know what I'm up to, I'm not doing my job very well. Like, because for all you know, I could be
Mm-hmm.
wasting that money.
Yeah, speaking of that, can you give me one example of a key difference between your career as a publicly paid scientist versus working in the private sector?
Yeah, I mean that really is
Yeah,
the big difference. The one we just talked about. Yeah, it's the
it's a
difference in
okay.
the private sector and even scientists in the private sector. Sometimes their companies let them write papers that go into journals, but a lot of times the company wants to keep the secrets inside the company so that the company can be more profitable. And I
Sure,
get that. I
sure,
mean
yeah.
that's the whole point of a company is
Mm-hmm.
to make a profit. But when you're a publicly paid scientist, you have to be very open about what you do and what your methods are and how you're spending public money. And actually, I will say that like the money that we spend in the world of NASA funded projects, there's a lot of safeguards to make sure that the money is spent appropriately. Like you can't hire
Mm-hmm.
your brother's consultant company to do work
Right.
for you. That's fraud, and there are checks to make sure that that can't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, like in terms of the public talks I've given, there's a great organization called Nerd Night, which I think is in like 30 or 50 cities around the world now. It started, I'm not sure where it started, but it's been in San Francisco and New York for
Oh
many
yeah,
many
you did
years
an
now, and
interview with them too, right? And on YouTube, yeah.
yes, exactly. I did San Francisco Nerd Night. I
Mm.
did Nerd Night East Bay in Oakland. I've gone to the California Academy of Sciences a couple of times to talk to the public and give lectures there, and just sort of try to raise public awareness of space science and try to encourage kids to study space science. You try to inspire people. It's important that more Americans study science, technology, engineering, and math, the so-called STEM fields. You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
there's a reason that 50% of scientists in the U.S. are immigrants. It's because Americans are not studying these things. So I think America needs to produce more of its own scientists. But of course, America has always been a welcoming country for immigrants, especially in science. So
Well,
both can exist.
that's a very good message to our president of the United States.
Yeah, sometimes America feels less friendly to immigrants if you watch the news too much, but within science, it's very immigrant friendly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. We've been friends since 2008, and this is something I want to provide a bit more context to the audience. Right around the time when I moved to the US and my English wasn't nearly as good, right? Remember that time?
Hmm.
Long time ago,
I do.
12 years ago. There were so many slang words that I didn't understand during conversations, and you were very helpful in helping me understand what people were saying and what the jokes were about. And I know many first generation immigrants like myself find it difficult to fit into the Western society, and not everyone is fortunate enough to have a great friend like you to teach them and make them feel accepted and welcomed.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have any advice for those immigrants like me? What should they do when they face such challenges in cultural barrier and the language barrier, what are some things they could do to fit in much quicker?
Yeah, it's definitely hard. You know, English is a terribly hard language to learn, and those of us native speakers, I don't think enough of us realize how difficult it is. So many exceptions, and then not only the slang, but all the idioms, like, you know, straight from the horse's mouth, or the shoe was on the other foot. I mean, there's so many sayings. You're like, what does that mean? Like, you know, and someone has to explain them to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so my advice would be, one, watch a lot of American comedies because that's where you learn slang. But you learn more slang watching TV sitcoms than you will watching dramas. Um, for example, I would also say make friends with native speakers. And while you should definitely make friends with Americans, it's also worth making friends with non-American English native speakers. So Irish, Canadian, New Zealand, Australia, British, you know, Scottish, English, Welsh, people who have native English speaking, but also are immigrants, because they might be more patient with you, or they might be
Right.
more understanding of
They have more
your immigrant
empathy.
situation,
Mm-hmm.
because they're immigrants too. Now, of course, that's not to say that there aren't plenty of, you know, wonderful Americans who will who would be happy to have an immigrant friend and be happy to explain all those things to you. So I think as long as you're open and friendly and enthusiastic and you're open to making friends, I think you will find a good mixture of both Americans and English-speaking non-Americans who will help you through that.
For sure. Yeah, that reminds me of this term called "don't put all your eggs in one basket."
Yes, that's another idiom. Yes, exactly.
Right? So, based on your advice, you should spread your eggs into different baskets and don't just make effort on making friends with American people. And to me, I actually had that experience. I found it a little difficult to approach to American people when I was in school, at least
Hmm.
many years ago, trying to make friends. And definitely there have been some frustrating experience. And I wish I knew about this advice early on, which is, don't get so frustrated if it's so difficult. Then try approach to other native speakers who are immigrated from, say, Ireland, New
Hmm.
Zealand, and many Canada, right?
Yeah.
Which they share much more empathy, and they will more likely to help you to fit into the Western culture a bit more.
Totally. And also, I should say, I mean, there's people from lots of other countries who have excellent English. Also, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't say only be friends with people from those five countries that I named, but it's good to have a broad range of friends because diversity always brings a diversity of opinions, and that gives you
Right.
better perspectives. It allows you as an immigrant to put yourself in the shoes of Americans, but also other immigrants from other places like Europe or Asia or even
Mm-hmm.
Africa, and it lets you sort of see the world from their perspective, and that's only going to be good because in any corporate culture, in any company, there's always potential misunderstandings where you think someone did something on purpose, but they just didn't know what they were doing. And so having a broader perspective lets you work more collaboratively with people.
Right, for sure. Yeah. Thanks
Yeah.
so much for that advice. I love it. So now you've been living in the U.S. for 19 years. Have you ever felt like an outsider living
Yeah.
in the
Oh,
U.S.? Yes.
yeah, totally. Especially when I first moved here, it's you have the different accent, you have a different culture, you have a different passport, and you have a big thing saying temporary visa,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to go to a different line at the airport where they ask you tons of questions. And America sometimes does not feel very welcoming, and so I didn't feel American at all for the first several years that I
Mm.
lived here. I felt like an outsider. I think an outsider people liked generally. People generally like Irish people, and that was a useful thing for me. But I didn't feel terribly like my identity was still very much Irish. Um, uh, but then the longer I spent here, and particularly after I got my green card, when you get the little thing in the mail that says "Welcome to the USA," which is sort of weird because you've been there for like 9 or 10 years already, and,
Right.
and it says "Welcome to the USA." And then when you go to the different line at the airport, and they actually say things like "Welcome home, sir," I remember like that was actually pretty emotional the first time
Did you
the
cry?
immigration guard. No, but it was definitely, it was like, yeah, that's actually really nice. And they, once you feel more like you're being welcomed, and it took a long time to get to that point. And another interesting thing was in 2008, I was watching the Olympics, and I was
Mm-hmm.
still on a J visa, I think. And I remember I would always cheer against the American team, always, because the US would, they would win so often. Like I would always cheer against the USA in the Olympics, and in 2008 I did it again. In 2012, after I got my green card and they said like welcome home, without even noticing it, I found myself wanting the U.S. Swimmers to win in the race. I was like, whoa, like when did that happen? Like because my identity had shifted a little bit because I felt more welcomed here. And but that was like what, that was 2012, so that was 11 years after I arrived. So it takes a while
Right,
to feel truly comfortable in the U.S., even for someone who's a native English speaker like me.
right. What would you say is your biggest strength as an immigrant?
I think being able to see things from other perspectives, and having a naturally, when you're from a small country like Ireland, if you read the newspaper in Ireland, there's not that much stuff going on because it's a small country. So most of the news is from everywhere else. It's mostly international news.
Mm,
And so I think compared to someone who was born in America, for someone from outside the US, it's much easier to have an international perspective. I think Americans have to work really hard to get an international perspective because America is so big. Um,
and a
so
lot
I
of
think
American people don't have passports.
that's right. That's right. I think actually before they required passports to go to Mexico and Canada, which was what, like 2010 or something like that, before that only 12% of Americans had a passport.
12%. Oh wow.
12%. It's much higher now because you need one for Canada and Mexico, but it was
Mm-hmm.
very low. So coming from a small country, you have a naturally international viewpoint, and I think that's the biggest strength that I feel that I have as an immigrant. Yeah.
Right. Wow, we actually chatted quite a lot, more than we expected. But I do have another question for you before we
Uh-huh.
wrap up. And we all know that America has been through quite a lot, especially during the pandemic. Do
Hmm.
you think the American dream is still true? Is it still worth chasing?
Well, the
Chasing.
American dream. Sorry. Oh yeah, I think yes. To answer yes, it's definitely still worth chasing. The American dream has always been a little bit of a fiction, a little bit of a myth that people, have used to say, oh, you can do anything in the U.S. And that's true in some ways, in the sense that like America has a great openness to entrepreneurs. If you have two failed businesses in America, you can just go start a third one, and people won't hold that against you. And in fact, the bankruptcy laws in this country actually let you do that pretty easily. So
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, America really is pretty unique in terms of being a place where you can be very successful. But in terms of your likelihood of going from poverty to being rich, in general, you have a better chance in many other countries than you do in the U.S. But immigrants, I think, have an advantage here because immigrants naturally, if you're willing to leave your home country and come to America, you probably have a lot more natural drive and ambition, and America is receptive to that. So America is a place that respects the that sort of immigrant ambition here still. I mean, just look at say Sergey Brin or Elon Musk or all these founders of these huge tech uh, companies that are so successful. So I think the American dream does exist, and I think it will still exist. Yeah.
Right. That's why we're still here. We're not going back.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. This is so great. I'm so glad we got a chance to chat today.
Me too.
Yeah, that's super awesome. We've been friends for so many years, but still, there's still things we don't know about each other, right?
Sure.
Thanks so much for all the wonderful insight and advice you shared today. We actually exceeded our time, so we're just gonna wrap up. And for the audience, if you have any specific questions for Rob, we can make sure we create a post on the Facebook page, and then you can follow up with Rob with any specific questions you have. And again, thank you so much, Rob, for taking your time joining us today. Thank you so much for sharing your stories, and thank you so much for your inspiration too.
Thank you for inviting me, Jessie. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Bye, everyone.